Black sisters banned from private jet, until dad's identity destroys everyone. Hello, my beautiful family, and welcome back to the channel. I want to express my deepest gratitude for each and every one of you. Your support, your comments, and your shared stories create a community that is truly special, and I am so honored to be a part of it with you. Today, we have a story that will test your heart. It's a story about dignity, prejudice, and the fierce, unbreakable love of a family. It asks a question many of us have faced in quieter ways. What do you do when the world tries to tell you that you don't belong in a place you've earned? Let's begin. They were honor students, they were sisters, and they were supposed to be on vacation. But when the staff at the private airport saw two young black women, they saw criminals never suspecting that the father the girls were about to call didn't just charter the jet. He owned the entire airline. The Miami sun, a benevolent tyrant of gold and heat, spilled across the polished hardwood floors of the Whitmore penthouse. It illuminated the specks of dust dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten world. For 17-year-old Zara Whitmore, the light was a starting pistol. It signaled the beginning of something magnificent, a week of freedom in the Bahamas, a reward for a grueling junior year that had seen her and her twin sister, Yolanda, not just succeed, but soar. Zara was the planner, the anchor. Her suitcase was already packed, lying open on her bed like a clamshell revealing its pearls. Each outfit was meticulously chosen, folded with geometric precision, and catalogued in a list on her phone. She was currently cross-referencing her European history textbook with a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, not for an assignment, but for pleasure. Her mind was a garden that always needed tending. Her movements were calm, deliberate. Her presence a pool of serene water. Are you seriously reading dumbass right now? Yolanda's voice, a vibrant melody to Zara's steady rhythm, echoed from her own room across the hall. We have a plane to catch, Z. A private plane. The only character you should be concerned with is yourself, reclining on a beach with a ridiculously colored beverage. Yolanda appeared in the doorway, a whirlwind of creative chaos. Where Zara's room was minimalist and ordered, Yolanda's was an explosion of life. Canvases leaned against the walls, some splattered with the vibrant, angry blues and passionate reds of her latest work. Her suitcase was a disaster zone. She held up two bikinis, one a sunny, optimistic yellow, the other a deep, dramatic crimson. Which one screams, I have survived a P-calculus, and I am here to be celebrated more? She asked, striking a pose that was half supermodel, half comedian. Zara looked up from her book, a slow smile spreading across her face. Definitely the crimson. It matches your righteous indignation. Exactly. It's my victory color. Yolanda tossed the yellow one onto the mountain of clothes on her bed and began expertly stuffing the crimson bikini into a side pocket of her overflowing bag. I still can't believe Dad pulled this off. I thought for sure he'd be too busy. I figured we'd be flying commercial, stuck between a screaming baby and a man who mistakes the armrest for a territorial claim. Dad always comes through, Zara said, her voice soft with a certainty that was as foundational to her as the ground beneath her feet. She closed her book, the soft thud of the cover a sound of finality. Junior year was over. The future was a bright, shimmering horizon. Their father, David Whitmore, was a man who didn't just come through, he built the very road to come through on. Miles away, in a steel and glass tower that pierced the downtown Miami skyline, David sat in a leather chair that was more throne than seat. His office was a testament to a life spent defying gravity, both literally and metaphorically. Models of sleek, futuristic jets lined the bookshelves, gleaming under recessed lighting. The wall behind his desk was a single pane of glass, offering a panoramic view of the city he had, in many ways, conquered. He was on a conference call, his voice a low, commanding baritone that could soothe rattled investors and intimidate stubborn rivals with equal ease. The projections are solid, Thomas. We're not just acquiring assets, we're acquiring strategic footholds. Skyline is no longer a regional player. We're setting a new global standard for executive travel. He listened for a moment, his gaze drifting to a framed photo on his desk. It was of two little girls with missing front teeth and identical bright bows in their hair, their arms slung around his neck. They were grinning with the pure, unadulterated joy that only children possess. A faint smile touched his lips. Everything he did, every negotiation, every ruling hour, was for them. To build a world for them that was as big as their potential, a world without ceilings. He had grown up in a world full of ceilings. He remembered the sting of being watched in stores, the quiet condescension in meetings, the subtle but sharp pain of being underestimated. He had absorbed those wounds and used them as fuel, building Skyline Executive Aviation from a single leased plane into an industry behemoth. He had done it so that his daughters would only ever know the view from the top, so that their last name, Whitmore, would be a key, not a barrier. "Gentlemen, I have a hard stop," he said, his tone shifting from CEO to father. "I have a very important charter flight to oversee." He didn't elaborate. They didn't need to know it was for his children. They just needed to know his time was his own. After the call ended, he leaned back, the silence of the office wrapping around him like a blanket. He picked up the phone and dialed his personal assistant. "Cynthia, is the Gulfstream ready for my daughters? Flight plan filed for Nassau?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," Cynthia's efficient voice replied. "N77DDW is fully catered and waiting at the Miami Executive Airport. Captain Evans and the crew are on standby. I've sent the itinerary and confirmation to Zara's phone. Everything is taken care of." "Good," he said. And Cynthia added a note to the manifest. "Tell the crew to take exceptionally good care of them. They've earned this." "Of course, sir." He hung up and looked at the photo again. Zara and Yolanda, his brilliant, beautiful girls. He had given them everything he could, the best schools, a beautiful home, a life of comfort and opportunity. But the gift he was most proud of was the one they had forged themselves, their confidence. They walked through the world with an easy grace, an assumption of belonging that he had fought his entire life to achieve for them. They had never had to question whether a space was meant for them. Today, they would be flying on one of his jets, a physical manifestation of his legacy. The thought filled him with a profound, quiet pride. What is the greatest gift a parent can give a child? Is it security, opportunity, or something less tangible, like the unwavering belief in their own worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Back at the penthouse, the final preparations were complete. Yolanda had finally managed to zip her suitcase, a feat of engineering that required her to sit on it. Zara stood by the door, her own perfectly packed bag at her feet, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You know," Zara said, "if you folded, you could fit twice as much." "And lose all the spontaneity?" Yolanda shot back, grabbing her purse. "My chaos is a system, Z. You just don't understand its genius. They laughed, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. They were a perfect study. In contrast, Zara, the calm, intellectual force, Yolanda, the fiery, creative spirit. But together, they were a complete person, their bond a seamless, unspoken language. They were each other's greatest allies, fiercest defenders, and most honest critics. The ride to the Miami Executive Airport was filled with the easy chatter of two people who knew each other better than they knew themselves. They talked about boys, about college applications, about the delicious irony of their art history teacher, a man who loathed modernism, having to give Yolanda an A for her abstract expressionist final project. They were buzzing with the pure, unadulterated energy of youth on the cusp of adventure. The taxi pulled away from the bustling thoroughfares of the city and into the serene, manicured world of private aviation. Here, the buildings were low-slung and discreet, the landscaping immaculate. There were no crowds, no long lines, no sense of frantic hurry. This was a world of quiet luxury, of seamless, invisible service. It was the world their father had built. As they stepped out of the cab, the scent of jet fuel, faint and clean, hung in the air. It was a smell Zara and Yolanda associated with family vacations, with the thrill of departure. A sleek, silver Gulfstream G650 was visible on the tarmac, its lines sharp and powerful against the brilliant blue sky. N77DW, their father's initials. There she is, Yolanda breathed, her artist's eye taking in the beauty of the machine. Dad has good taste. The best, Zara agreed, her heart swelling with a familiar mix of love and pride. They pulled their suitcases toward the polished glass doors of the Skyline Executive Aviation terminal, their steps light, their faces bright with anticipation. They were two young women on the verge of a well-deserved celebration, stepping into a space created by their own father's sweat and genius. They had no reason to believe they were anything other than welcome. They had no idea that in the next 10 minutes, the world their father had so carefully constructed to protect them was about to be shattered by the one thing his money couldn't erase. The door slid open with a soft whoosh, and they stepped inside. The calm was over. The storm was about to begin. The air inside the Skyline Executive Aviation terminal was 20 degrees cooler than the Miami heat, a manufactured chill that smelled of expensive cleaning products and faint, sweet leather. It was the kind of cold that was supposed to feel exclusive, a respite from the common warmth outside. But as the glass doors slid shut behind them, the coolness felt less like a luxury and more like a warning. A woman sat behind a large, intimidatingly minimalist desk of dark wood and chrome. Her nameplate read BRENDA. She had perfectly coiffed blonde hair that looked as solid as a helmet, and her smile, when she finally looked up from her computer, didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze swept over Zara and Yolanda, a quick, dismissive inventory that took in their trendy but casual clothes, their braided hair, and the color of their skin. The smile tightened. "Can I help you?" she asked. The words were polite, but the tone was that of a gatekeeper, not a concierge. Zara, ever the poised diplomat, stepped forward. "Good morning. We're Zara and Yolanda Whitmore. We're here for the 10 a.m. flight to Nassau." Brenda's fingers tapped on her keyboard, a series of sharp, deliberate clicks. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the air conditioning. Zara could feel Yolanda shifting her weight beside her, a subtle sign of her sister's growing impatience. "Whitmore?" Brenda repeated, drawing the name out as if it tasted unfamiliar. She squinted at her screen. "I'm sorry, I don't see a Whitmore on the manifest for the 10 a.m. Nassau flight. The statement was delivered with a cool finality, as if that were the end of the matter. For a beat, Zara was simply confused. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. Her father's organization was a well-oiled machine. Mistakes like this didn't happen. "Can't be right," Zara said, her voice steady. "The jet is N77DW, a Gulfstream 650. The flight was confirmed by Cynthia Powers." She pulled out her phone, her movements efficient, and opened the email. She held it out for Brenda to see. "The confirmation is right here." Brenda glanced at the phone screen, but didn't lean in to read it. She gave a small, condescending sniff. "Emails can be mistaken. The official manifest is what we go by. And you're not on it." Yolanda stepped forward, her easygoing energy from the car ride evaporating. "Mistaken? It's from our father's PA. From this company. Look at the email address." Brenda's eyes flickered to Yolanda, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The smile vanished completely. "Please don't raise your voice, miss. I'm simply telling you what the system says." "I'm not raising my voice," Yolanda replied, her own voice low and tight with a new, dangerous edge. "I'm asking you to do your job. The plane is right out there. N77DW. David Whitmore's initials. We are his daughters." The mention of their father's full name did nothing. Brenda's face remained a mask of placid obstruction. It was in that moment that a cold dread began to seep into Zara's bones, a dread far colder than the air conditioning. This wasn't about a clerical error. The way Brenda was looking at them, the way she refused to even properly consider their evidence, it was a deliberate wall. They weren't being treated as valued clients who had encountered a problem. They were being treated as a problem to be dismissed. "Perhaps you're at the wrong FBO," Brenda suggested, her voice dripping with false helpfulness. "There are several charter companies at this airport." "We are at the right FBO," Zara said, her voice dropping, becoming colder, sharper. "This is Skyline Executive Aviation. Our father is David Whitmore. The flight was chartered for us. I can show you my ID." "That won't be necessary," a man's voice interrupted. A man in a tailored gray suit had emerged from an office behind the desk. He was tall, with slicked back hair and a practiced, authoritative air. His name tag identified him as ROBERTMILLARTERMIAASUPERV. He gave the sisters a smile that was even less genuine than Brenda's. It was a thin, patronizing curve of the lips. "Ladies, is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes lingering on Yolanda. Brenda spoke before they could. "Robert, these young women are insisting they have a flight, but they're not on the manifest. I've explained the situation." Robert nodded slowly, looking from the girls to the pristine, empty lounge. "I see. And what flight did you think you were on?" He addressed Zara, but his tone was the one you'd use for a confused child. "We don't think we know," Yolanda snapped. "The 10A M to Nassau on the G650 N77DW. Robert's patronizing smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Now, let's all just remain calm. I'm sure this is just a simple misunderstanding." He turned his focus to Zara, clearly identifying her as the more reasonable one. "Who exactly arranged this flight for you? A friend? A benefactor?" The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. "Benefactor," The implication was grotesque, a smear of ugly suggestion that they couldn't possibly have access to this world on their own terms. That they were here under the charity or purchase of someone else. Zara's blood ran cold. The polite facade she had maintained was cracking. Our father arranged it. David Whitmore. I can call him if you'd like. I'm sure that won't be necessary, Robert said smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. Look, our manifests are triple-checked. Security protocols are very strict. We can't just let anyone onto the tarmac. I'm sure you understand. It was the anyone that did it. The casual, dismissive word that lumped them in with random trespassers, with people who didn't belong. The space around them, once a symbol of their father's success, now felt alien and hostile. The polished floors reflected their images back at them. Two young black women standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that they were out of place. Yolanda's hand, which had been clenched at her side, slowly rose. She lifted her phone, the screen already on, and pressed the red record button. The small, glowing light was a tiny act of rebellion in the cold, sterile room. Robert's eyes narrowed. What do you think you're doing? Documenting this, Yolanda said, her voice shaking with a fury she was struggling to contain. Documenting the excellent customer service at Skyline Executive Aviation. That's against our privacy policy, Brenda chirped from the desk. Is it against your policy to racially profile your customers too? Yolanda shot back. The accusation, now spoken aloud, electrified the air. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Robert's face, which had been a mask of condescending professionalism, flushed a blotchy red. That is a very serious and baseless accusation, young lady, he said, his voice dangerously low. I'm going to have to ask you to stop filming and leave the premises. You are now trespassing. We're trespassing? Zara's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a razor. We are standing in the terminal of a company our father owns, waiting for a plane he sent for us, and you're calling us trespassers? Robert actually scoffed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. Owns? Ma'am, I know who owns this company. I've met Mr. Whitmore. And you are not his daughters. The denial was so absolute, so confident, it stole the air from Zara's lungs. He wasn't just mistaken. He was so certain in his prejudice, so convinced that David Whitmore's daughters couldn't possibly look like them, that he stated it as a fact. He had erased their identity. I'll call the crew, Robert said, turning his back on them to speak into a walkie-talkie on his desk. Captain Evans, can you and a flight attendant please come to the main terminal? We have a situation. A moment later, two figures in crisp pilot and flight attendant uniforms walked in from the tarmac. Captain Evans was a man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that immediately sized up the scene with a weary authority. The flight attendant was a younger woman, her face a practiced blend of friendly and firm. They looked at Robert, then at the two girls, then back at Robert. An entire conversation happened in that silent exchange. It was a closing of ranks. Are these the passengers? Captain Evans asked, his gaze on the girls clinical and detached. They claim to be, Robert said. They're not on my manifest. They have no official boarding passes. They're refusing to leave. Then they can't board, the pilot said simply, as if discussing the weather. My flight log is clear. I can't let unauthorized individuals on the aircraft. It's a federal regulation. It was a lie. They all knew it. In private aviation, Manifests were often fluid. The owner's word was law. A simple phone call was all that was required. But they weren't making a phone call. They were building a wall of procedure and regulation, and using it to hide what was really happening. They were being denied because of how they looked. Humiliation washed over Zara in a hot, sickening wave. She thought of her father, of the pride in his voice when he talked about his company, about the legacy he was building for them. He had built this empire to protect them from exactly this feeling, this kind of moment. And here they were, in the heart of that empire, being treated like filth. Yolanda's phone was still recording, a silent, steady witness. Her knuckles were white where she gripped it. Tears of pure rage and hurt welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "If you do not leave the premises in the next 60 seconds, Robert said, his voice now laced with undisguised menace, "I will be forced to call airport security and have you removed." The threat landed. Removed. Arrested. For what? For trying to go on vacation. For being their father's daughters. The dream of the Bahamas, of the sun and the sea, felt like a distant, childish fantasy. The reality was this cold room, these cold eyes, this ugly, baseless hatred. Zara felt a tremor start in her hands. All her life, she had been told that if she was smart enough, poised enough, prepared enough, the world would open its doors. It was a lie. She looked at her sister's trembling chin, at the defiant anger in her eyes, and something inside her solidified. The hurt was still there, a sharp physical pain in her chest, but beneath it, a different feeling was hardening. It was a cold, clear, diamond, hard resolve. They would not be removed. They would not be erased. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, Zara Whitmore raised her own phone. She ignored Robert's sputtering protests. She ignored Brenda's glare and the pilot's stony silence. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering for a second over the entry she was looking for. Then she pressed the button. The phone began to ring, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence of the terminal. She held it up so they could all see the name on the screen. D. Her eyes met Robert's, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his. He still didn't believe her. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The bomb had landed, and now, with this phone call, the fuse was lit. The ringing of Zara's phone was a siren in the frozen tableau of the terminal. Each chime seemed to amplify the tension, stretching the moment into an elastic, unbearable silence. The four uniformed figures, Brenda, Robert, Captain Evans, and the flight attendant watched the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Their resistance, once an impenetrable fortress of corporate policy and personal bias, had just been challenged by a force they hadn't anticipated, a direct line to the man whose name was on the building. David Whitmore answered on the third ring. His voice, warm and rich, filled the small speaker of Zara's phone. "Hey, sweetheart, you should be in the air by now. Everything okay?" The sound of her father's voice, so normal and loving, was a stark contrast to the hostility of the room. It almost broke Zara. For a fleeting second, she wanted to crumble, to let the tears of humiliation fall and tell him how awful these people were. But then she looked at Yolanda, whose chin was still held high, whose own phone was still a steadfast, recording eye. Zara's spine stiffened. This wasn't just about their hurt feelings anymore. It was about the ugly truth that had been exposed. "Hi, Dad," Zara said, her voice remarkably even. She kept her eyes locked on Robert Miller. "We're having a little trouble at the terminal." "Trouble?" David's voice sharpened instantly, the paternal warmth replaced by a CEO's incisiveness. What kind of trouble? Is there a problem with the plane? No, the plane is fine, Dad. It's the staff. She let the words hang in the air, a deliberate, pointed accusation. Robert Miller took a half-step forward, his face a mottled patchwork of anger and a dawning, sickening realization. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps offer an explanation, or to try and take control of the narrative. But Zara gave him no room. The terminal supervisor, a Mr. Robert Miller, and the receptionist, Brenda, have refused us entry, Zara continued, her voice clinical, as if she were reading a report. They say we're not on the manifest. They've accused us of lying. They've threatened to call security and have us removed for trespassing. On the other end of the line, there was a dead, chilling silence. It was the kind of silence that preceded a hurricane. When David spoke again, his voice was lethally calm. Put Mr. Miller on the phone. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Zara held the phone out to Robert. Her hand was steady. Her expression was unreadable. Robert stared at the phone, as if Zara were offering him a lit stick of dynamite. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. He licked his lips, his practiced confidence utterly deserting him. He could see his career, his comfortable life, his sense of authority. He had made a catastrophic, world-ending mistake. He had resisted the evidence of the confirmation email. He had resisted the girl's clear, articulate explanations. He had resisted the very possibility that they were who they said they were, all because of a deep-seated prejudice he would never have admitted he had. He had been so sure of his own judgment, so certain that he knew what David Whitmore's daughters would look like. His resistance was born of arrogance, and now that arrogance was about to cost him everything. Hesitantly, his hand trembling slightly, he took the phone. Hello? He stammered. David's voice came through the speaker, no longer a calm baritone, but a low, dangerous growl that promised retribution. Who is this? Robert Miller, sir. Terminal supervisor. Mr. Miller, David began, and the words "ire" was now an insult. You have two young women standing in front of you. Their names are Zara and Yolanda Whitmore. They are my daughters. You have just, to my understanding, denied them access to my aircraft, insulted them, and threatened them. Before I get in my car and drive down there to personally ensure that you never work in the state of Florida again, I want you to give me one good reason why you are still employed by my company. The blood drained from Robert's face. He looked wildly around the room, as if searching for an escape route. His eyes landed on Brenda, whose face was a mask of pure terror. She was furiously trying to signal him, shaking her head, her eyes wide with panic. She was in full retreat, attempting to distance herself from the disaster she had helped create. Her initial, smug resistance had evaporated, replaced by a desperate instinct for self-preservation. She began typing furiously on her computer, perhaps trying to retroactively fix the manifest, to cover their tracks, but it was far too late. Captain Evans and the flight attendant, who had been observing with a detached air of authority, now looked deeply uncomfortable. Their own resistance had been passive but complicit. They had trusted their supervisor, followed protocol, and in doing so, had become part of the wall the girls had faced. They exchanged a look, a silent, panicked conversation passing between them. They were officers of the flight, but they were employees of the company. A company whose owner was now, by the sound of it, on a warpath. Robert, holding the phone, was a man in freefall. Mr. Whitmore, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. It was the coward's defense, the last resort of the guilty. There is no misunderstanding. David's voice boomed from the phone, loud enough for everyone in the pristine, silent terminal to hear. My daughters are standing in a building with my name on it, being treated like criminals by the very people I pay to ensure my clients' comfort and safety. You looked at my children and you saw a threat. You saw anything but who they are. So I ask you again, Mr. Miller. Why? Why? Question hung in the air, stripping away all the excuses, all the talk of manifests and protocols. It demanded the real answer. The ugly one. Robert couldn't answer. He couldn't say because they were black. Because they were young. Because they didn't fit my image of wealth and power. He couldn't admit that his entire worldview, the one that had allowed him to rise to a position of moderate authority, was built on a rotten foundation of prejudice. So he said nothing. He just stood there, shaking, the phone pressed to his ear like an instrument of his own execution. Put my daughter back on the phone, David commanded. Robert numbly handed the phone back to Zara. His hand was clammy. Zara, David's voice was softer now, but still tight with fury. I'm on my way. Don't move. Don't let them move. I will be there in 20 minutes. Okay, Dad, Zara said quietly. And, Zara, tell your sister to keep that camera rolling. Zara nodded, a silent acknowledgement, and ended the call. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the 4 employees, who were now trapped in a prison of their own making. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with seismic force. Brenda had stopped typing. She sat frozen, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The flight attendant was studiously examining her own fingernails. Captain Evans cleared his throat, taking a step forward. Miss Whitmore, he began, his voice now laced with a desperate, placating tone. On behalf of the flight crew, I deeply apologize for this confusion. If you'll allow us, we can get you boarded immediately. We can be in the air in 15 minutes. He was trying to fix it, to smooth it over, get them on the plane, and pretend it never happened. He was resisting the consequences. He wanted to rewind time, to get back to the comfortable illusion that they were all just professionals doing their jobs. But Yolanda took a step forward, her phone still held up like a shield. We're not going anywhere, she said, her voice steely. My dad said to wait. The finality in her tone shut down any further attempts at a quick resolution. The offer to board, which should have been the first thing they heard upon arrival, now felt like an insult. A bribe to buy their silence. They all stood in the silent, chilly terminal, waiting. The girls stood together, a united front of wounded but unbreakable dignity. The 4 employees stood apart, isolated in their own dawning shame and fear. The resistance was over. They had tried to deny the girls' identity, their place in this world, and in doing so, had set a time bomb that was about to detonate. The clock was ticking. 20 minutes. David Whitmore was coming, and with him, the reckoning. The silence wasn't calm anymore. It was the deafening sound of a world about to break. The 20 minutes that followed Zara's phone call were the longest of anyone's life. The Skyline Executive Aviation Terminal, once a symbol of prestige and efficiency, transformed into a high-stakes waiting room, thick with unspoken accusations and the suffocating weight of impending doom. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait for the arrival of the man who held all their futures in his hands. The circumstances, orchestrated by a single phone call, had bound them all together in a shared, agonizing limbo. Zara and Yolanda stood near the expansive window overlooking the tarmac. They didn't sit. Sitting felt like a concession, a softening of their stance. They stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, drawing strength from each other's presence. Yolanda's phone was still recording, though she now held it more discreetly at her side, the lens still pointed forward, a silent, unblinking observer. The initial, hot fury had cooled into a hard, protective shell. They spoke in low murmurs, their own private language in a room full of enemies. "Can you believe them?" Yolanda whispered, her eyes fixed on the G650 that sat gleaming in the sun. It looked like a monument to a promise that had been broken. Misunderstanding. He looked right at us and decided we were liars. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Yar replied, her voice soft but firm. "It was a choice. They made a choice about who they thought we were." She wrapped her arms around herself, a subconscious gesture of self-protection. The professional chill of the room had seeped into her bones. She felt a deep, profound disillusionment. Her entire life, she had believed in the power of intellect, poise, and preparation. She had always thought that if she presented herself with unassailable dignity, she would be immune to the ugliness of prejudice. Today, that belief had been shattered. Her perfect grades, her calm demeanor, her father's name, none of it had mattered in the face of raw, unreasoning bias. Across the room, the four employees formed a scattered, miserable constellation of fear. They were unable to separate, trapped by David Whitmore's command to not let them move. They avoided eye contact with each other, and, most of all, with the two young women they had wronged. Their shared guilt was a tangible thing, poisoning the air between them. Brenda sat rigidly at her desk, staring at her computer screen, which displayed the now corrected manifest. The names CARWHITMORE and YOLANDAWHITMORE shone in stark, accusing clarity. It was an admission of her error, a digital confession. She kept rereading the names, as if trying to understand how she could have been so wrong, so blind. Her mind raced, replaying the initial interaction. The girls hadn't been loud or aggressive. They had been polite. Yet, she had dismissed them instantly. Why? The question echoed the one David Whitmore had roared through the phone, and she had no answer she was willing to face. She felt a knot of shame and terror tighten in her stomach. Robert Miller paced. He walked from his office door to the chrome legs of the reception desk and back again, his expensive shoes making soft, panicked sounds on the polished floor. He loosened his tie, his face slick with the sheen of cold sweat. With every step, he was composing and discarding frantic, useless arguments in his head. It was a security issue. I was just following protocol. The manifest was blank. But every excuse crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The smear he'd given them, the word benefactor, the utter certainty with which he had declared you are not his daughters. He had not been a supervisor enforcing rules. He had been a bully enforcing his own prejudices. He was trapped, not just in the terminal, but in the prison of his own colossal misjudgment. Captain Evans and the flight attendant, whose name was Jessica, stood near the entrance to the tarmac, their professional uniforms now feeling like costumes in a grim play. They were caught in the crossfire. "We should have just called him," Jessica murmured to the captain, her voice barely audible. "The moment they said the name, we should have just radioed the office and confirmed." Captain Evans stared out at the aircraft, his jaw tight. "I trusted my ground supervisor. That's the chain of command." It was a weak defense, and he knew it. He was a captain. His authority superseded Miller's when it came to his flight. He could have intervened. He could have asked to see the email, made a call, de-escalated. But he hadn't. He had seen two young black girls and a flustered white supervisor, and had instinctively, perhaps subconsciously, sided with the familiar authority figure. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path had led directly to this disaster. His resistance was to complication, to rocking the boat. Now, the boat wasn't just rocked, it was sinking, and he was on board. This forced proximity was a crucible. With every passing second, the superficial layers of their roles, receptionist, supervisor, pilot, were stripped away, revealing the deeper emotions beneath. Shame, fear, a dawning, horrifying self-awareness. They were no longer just employees. They were individuals about to face a personal reckoning. For Zara and Yolanda, the waiting was different. It wasn't about fear of punishment. It was about waiting for validation, for the world to be set right again. But a deeper, more painful emotion was beginning to surface. The incident had cracked the very foundation of their safety. Their father's name, his wealth, his power, it was a shield. Yes, but it wasn't impenetrable. They had just discovered, in the most brutal way, that there were still people in the world who would see only their skin color and render every other part of their identity invisible. Yolanda finally broke the silence between them. "Do you think he knows?" she asked, her voice small. Zara turned to her. "Knows what?" "That this happens," Yolanda clarified, her gaze distant. "That it doesn't matter if your name is on the building. That people will still see you like that." It was a question Zara had never dared to ask herself. She thought of her father as a titan, a man who moved through the world with unshakable confidence. But was that confidence, or was it armor? Had he faced this same ugly dismissal, this same casual dehumanization, 1,000 times on his way to the top? Had he built Skyline Executive Aviation, not just as a legacy for them, but as a fortress to protect himself? The thought was devastating. It recontextualized her entire life, her entire understanding of her father. The weight of his struggle, a struggle he had always shielded them from, settled on her for the first time. The pain she was feeling was not just her own, it was a generational echo. A sleek black car, a stark contrast to the bright Miami day, suddenly pulled up to the curb outside the terminal. It wasn't a taxi or a rideshare. It was David Whitmore's personal sedan. The engine cut off, and the silence that followed was more profound than any noise. Every person in the room froze. Robert Miller stopped his pacing mid-stride. Brenda's hands clamped onto the edge of her desk. Captain Evans straightened his back, as if bracing for a physical impact. The car door opened. David Whitmore emerged. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, but he wore it like armor. He didn't look at the building. He didn't look at the plane. His eyes, laser-focused and blazing with a cold, controlled rage, were fixed on the glass doors of the terminal. He started walking, his strides long and purposeful. He was not a man coming to have a discussion. He was a king coming to reclaim his territory and protect his own. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and David Whitmore stepped inside. The storm had arrived. The moment David Whitmore stepped into the terminal, the air crackled. The manufactured chill of the room was consumed by the heat of his fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical force, a gravitational pull that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the scene, taking in every detail with the speed of a supercomputer processing data. He saw the miserable, terrified faces of his employees. He saw the gleaming, empty Gulf Stream on the tarmac. And then his gaze landed on his daughters. He saw Zara, her arms still wrapped around herself, her posture a fortress of wounded dignity. He saw Yolanda, her phone still clutched in her hand, her chin held high in a gesture of defiance that mirrored his own. But he saw something else, too. He saw the tremor in Zara's lip she was trying to suppress. He saw the sheen of unshed tears in Yolanda's eyes. He saw the invisible wound that had been inflicted upon them, a wound he had spent his entire life trying to prevent. And in that instant, the cold fury of the CEO was eclipsed by the white-hot rage of a father. His eyes moved from his daughters to Robert Miller. "You," he said. The single word was not a greeting. It was an indictment. Robert flinched as if he'd been struck. "Mr. Whitmore, I can explain." "Can you?" David took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Can you explain why my daughters, my children, were threatened with arrest in my own facility? Can you explain the term benefactor to me?" The word, spoken in his own voice, was a gut punch to Robert. It was clear Zara had relayed every venomous detail. There was no hiding. He looked to Brenda for support, but she was staring at her desk, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, effectively severing her alliance with him. He looked to Captain Evans, who simply shook his head slightly, a clear signal, "You're on your own." "Sir, it was a mistake in the paperwork," Robert stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "A breakdown in communication. I was following security procedures." David stopped directly in front of him, so close that Robert was forced to crane his neck slightly to look up at him. "Security procedures?" David's voice was dangerously soft. "Let me tell you about security procedures, Mr. Miller. They are designed to protect our clients, not to humiliate them. They are designed to identify threats, not to invent them based on the color of someone's skin." He paused, letting the accusation settle. "You didn't see a paperwork error. You saw two young black women, and you made an assumption. You saw my daughters, and you saw criminals." The raw truth of the statement, spoken so plainly, stripped away Robert's last pathetic defense. He had no response. His silence was a confession. David turned away from him in disgust and walked toward his daughters. He enveloped them both in a powerful hug, pulling them tightly against his chest. For a moment, he just held them, his eyes closed, his chin resting on top of Zara's head. Zara felt the tension in his shoulders, the coiled strength in his arms. She felt the love, fierce and protective, but she also felt something else, a deep, familiar pain. In that embrace, the professional mask of David Whitmore, CEO, fell away completely. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion Zara had never heard from him before. It was a cocktail of anger, regret, and a profound, aching sorrow. "I am so sorry this happened to you." Yolanda finally let a single tear escape, and she buried her face in her father's suit jacket, the pristine fabric muffling her sob. The dam of her composure had broken under the safety of his arms. Zara leaned into him, feeling the solidness of his presence, a rock in the storm. It was in that moment of raw, shared vulnerability that the mystery of her father began to unravel for Zara. The question Yolanda had asked in the waiting, "Do you think he knows?" was answered not by words, but by the sheer, palpable weight of his reaction. This wasn't a new kind of anger for him. It was an old one. He pulled back, though he kept his hands on their shoulders, a protective barrier between them and the rest of the room. His eyes were still burning, but when he looked at them, there was a new depth, a shadow of a past he had never shared. "When I was 19, he began, his voice low, meant only for them, but loud enough to be overheard by the petrified employees. I had an internship with a major aerospace engineering firm. top of my class at Georgia Tech. I was the only black kid in the program. He stared past them, his gaze unfocused, seeing a ghost from 40 years ago. The final project was to present our designs to a panel of senior executives. The night before, I was working late in the main design lab, triple-checking my schematics. A security guard came in. He saw me, a black teenager, alone in a room full of expensive equipment. He didn't ask for my ID. He didn't ask what I was doing. He drew his weapon. The air left Zara's lungs. Yolanda's head shot up, her eyes wide with shock. He held me at gunpoint for 10 minutes, David continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which made the story even more terrifying. He called me every name you can imagine. He told me he knew I was there to steal things. I was so scared, I couldn't even speak. The only thing that saved me was my project lead, walking in to grab his briefcase. He diffused the whole thing. The next day, the security guard was still on duty. The executives told me it was a misstanding. They told me to be more aware of how my presence might be perceived after hours. He looked back at his daughters, his eyes connecting with theirs, and they finally understood. The fortress he had built wasn't just for them. It was to insulate himself from a world that had once held him at gunpoint for the crime of being ambitious while black. The pain they were feeling today was a direct echo of the trauma he had carried, silently, for decades. I swore, he said, his voice now a low, guttural growl. I swore I would build a world where my children would never, ever know that feeling. Where their name, our name, would be a shield. I thought I had succeeded. He looked over their heads at Robert Miller, and the look in his eyes was one of utter devastation and renewed, volcanic rage. And you, in my own house, you brought that world right to my doorstep. You put that poison right back into their lives. This was the backstory unveiled, not just of a company, but of a man. His entire life's work, every acquisition, every victory, was cast in a new light. It was an act of defiance. Skyline Executive Aviation was more than a business. It was a sanctuary he had tried to build. And his own employees had just desecrated it. Yolanda, her tears forgotten, lifted her phone again. She hadn't stopped recording. She had captured it all. Robert's pathetic excuses, her father's raw confession, the ugly truth that connected their present humiliation to his past trauma. It was no longer just a video of poor customer service. It was a testament, a piece of evidence documenting a deep, systemic rot. David saw the phone in her hand. He looked at the small, glowing red light, and a new expression crossed his face. It was the look of a man whose pain was crystallizing into purpose. The wound was no longer just a wound. It was becoming a weapon. He released his daughters and turned to face his employees. The father receded slightly, and the CEO returned, but a different kind of CEO. One who was no longer just protecting his legacy, but preparing to purify it with fire. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice now devoid of any heat, a chilling, absolute cold. "Captain Evans, Brenda, Jessica, all of you, my office, downtown, in 1 hour." He turned to Yolanda. "You too, and bring your phone." He then looked at Zara. "Sweetheart, you are going to write down every single thing that was said to you from the moment you walked through that door." He was no longer just reacting. He was building a case. The personal pain had become a catalyst for a corporate reckoning. Connection between father and daughters, forged in shared hurt, was now a bond of unified purpose. The emotional bomb had gone off, and the fallout was just beginning to spread. The hour that followed was a blur of motion and strained silence. The dream of the Bahamas was officially dead, replaced by the grim reality of what had to be done. David made a single, curt phone call, and within minutes, a second of his personal cars arrived. He sent Zara and Yolanda home in it, a silent acknowledgement that the penthouse was their sanctuary, a place they needed to be to process and prepare. He would follow after securing the terminal. Back in the familiar sunlit space of their home, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The beautiful suitcases, once packed with so much hope and excitement, now sat by the door like relics from another lifetime. The penthouse, usually a haven of peace, felt charged with the day's trauma. Yolanda immediately plugged her phone into her laptop, her movements sharp and focused. She began downloading the video files, her brow furrowed in concentration. The artist in her, usually dedicated to canvas and paint, was now channeling all her creative energy into compiling their evidence. Each click of the mouse was a small act of defiance, a way of reclaiming control. Zara, true to her nature and her father's instructions, sat at the large marble dining table. She opened her own laptop, the screen's glow illuminating her tired face. She began to write. At first, the words were clinical, a detached recounting of events. At approximately 9:35 a.m., we entered the Skyline Executive Aviation Terminal. The receptionist, Brenda, stated we were not on the manifest. But as she typed, the emotional dam began to crack. She wrote about Brenda's dismissive tone, the way her eyes had swept over them with such cool disdain. She wrote the word benefactor, and as her fingers typed the letters, a fresh wave of shame and anger washed over her. She wrote about Robert Miller's patronizing smile and the absolute, sickening certainty in his voice when he had erased their identity. You are not his daughters. Tears started to fall, silent drops that landed on the smooth surface of the table. She wasn't just writing a report anymore. She was bearing witness to their own humiliation. It was a painful, cathartic process, a way of lancing the wound and letting the poison out. Yolanda, seeing her sister's silent tears, came over and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, her presence a warm, solid comfort. Zara reached up and squeezed her sister's hand, a silent thank you. In that shared, quiet moment, their bond, always strong, deepened into something new. They were no longer just sisters. They were survivors of the same shipwreck, clinging to each other on a life raft. When David arrived an hour later, he found them like this, Yolanda standing guard while Zara wrote, the two of them a small, unbreakable unit against the world. He had shed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, and the exhaustion on his face was profound. He looked older than he had that morning. He walked over to the table and read what Zara had written, his expression growing darker with every sentence. When he finished, he gently closed the laptop. That's enough for now, sweetheart, he said, his voice soft. You've done well. He looked at both of them, his gaze full of a weary, fierce love. I need to go downtown. This is going to be a long day. We're coming with you, Yolanda said immediately. It wasn't a question. David hesitated. His first instinct, the paternal one that had guided him for 17 years, was to shield them, to send them to their rooms with a movie and takeout and handle the ugly business himself. He wanted to protect them from the fallout, just as he had always tried to protect them from the fight. But then he looked at their faces. He saw the resolve in Yolanda's eyes, the quiet strength in Zara's. They weren't little girls anymore. The day's events had forced them into a new, harsh adulthood. To shield them now would be to diminish their experience, to treat them as victims instead of the warriors they had proven themselves to be. He had raised them to be strong, confident women. He couldn't, in this crucial moment, deny them the right to see this through. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Let's go." The ride to the downtown office tower was silent. The three of them sat in the back of the sedan, a family united, not by a celebration, but by a battle. When they entered the Skyline corporate headquarters on the 40th floor, the atmosphere was funereal. Word had clearly traveled. Executives and assistants moved with a quiet, nervous energy, their eyes darting toward David and the two young women flanking him. They were no longer just the boss's daughters. They were the catalysts of the storm. David led them to the main boardroom, a vast, intimidating space dominated by a table of polished mahogany that could seat 30. At one end of the table, huddled together like defendants in a courtroom, sat Robert, Brenda, Captain Evans, and Jessica. They looked small and broken under the high ceilings and the panoramic view of the city. David took his place at the head of the table, the seat of ultimate power. He gestured for Zara and Yolanda to sit on either side of him. The message was clear. They were not just observers. They were part of this. What followed was not a shouting match. It was a slow, methodical dissection of the morning's events. David was no longer the raging father. He was the incisive, relentless CEO. He had Zara read her statement aloud. Her voice, though trembling at times, was clear and steady. She recounted every word, every look, every dismissive gesture. With each sentence, the four employees seemed to shrink further into their seats. Then, David had Yolanda play the video. She connected her phone to the room's massive screen, and suddenly, the sterile boardroom was filled with the raw, chaotic energy of the terminal. They all watched in horrified silence. They saw Yolanda's defiant, trembling chin. They saw Robert's condescending smirk. They heard his voice, amplified by the high-tech speakers, dripping with scorn. "Who exactly arranged this flight for you? A friend? A benefactor?" The video was undeniable. It was a perfect, damning record of prejudice in action. When it was over, a heavy, profound silence filled the room. There were no more excuses, no more talk of protocol. There was only the ugly truth displayed on a 12-foot screen. Brenda was the first to break. Sobs racked her body. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words muffled by her hands. "I don't know why. I'm so sorry." Her apology, born of fear and shame, was a desperate plea for mercy. Robert Miller just stared at the blank screen, his face ashen. He was a man who had been completely and utterly dismantled. It was in this moment of quiet devastation that a fragile, unexpected bond began to form, not between the perpetrators and the victims, but within the Whitmore family itself. Zara looked at her father. She saw the pain in his eyes as he listened to her statement, the flicker of his own past trauma as he watched the video. She finally understood the weight he carried, the silent battles he had fought. Her love for him, always vast, was now imbued with a new, profound layer of respect and empathy. David looked at his daughters. He saw their courage, their resilience, their refusal to be broken. They had faced down ugliness and had not only survived, but had documented it, fought back, and were now sitting beside him as equals in this fight. The pride he felt was overwhelming. It was a light in the darkness of the day. He had wanted to give them a world without ceilings, and in a way, they had just shown him that they were capable of shattering any ceiling placed in front of them. In our most difficult moments, we often discover a new depth in our relationships. Have you ever gone through a crisis with someone that ultimately brought you closer? I'd be honored to read your story in the comments. He reached out under the table and took both of their hands. Zara's on his left, Yolanda's on his right. He squeezed them, and they squeezed back. It was a closed circuit of strength, love, and shared purpose. They were no longer just a father and his daughters. They were a team, a united front. The healing hadn't truly begun, but the foundation for it was being laid. In the cold, sterile heart of the corporate machine, in the aftermath of a hateful act, the Whitmore family was bonding, healing, and preparing for the war to come. This was no longer just about a ruined vacation or a few fired employees. David looked at the terrified faces of his staff, and then at the determined faces of his daughters, and he knew. This was about changing everything. For 2 weeks, the Whitmore family operated as a single, unified force. The boardroom meeting had been the opening salvo in a war David Whitmore intended to win decisively. Robert Miller and Brenda were immediately terminated. Captain Evans and Jessica were suspended without pay. He hired an outside law firm, a team of ruthless litigators known for their scorched earth approach, to audit every corner of Skyline Executive Aviation. The penthouse transformed into a command center. Zara, with her meticulous, analytical mind, became the chief archivist. She organized documents, cross-referenced flight logs with customer complaints, and built a timeline of incidents that stretched back years. She discovered a subtle but undeniable pattern. Clients of color, particularly those who were new or flying without a known corporate sponsor, were disproportionately flagged for additional security verification. Their flights were more likely to be delayed, their catering orders misplaced, their ground transport confused. It was a quiet, insidious network of microaggressions, a systemic bias that the company's culture had allowed to fester. Yolanda, the artist and storyteller, took on a different role. She edited the video from that day, not for public release, but as a presentation for the board of directors. She skillfully wove together the footage from the terminal with the raw, emotional power of her father's story about the security guard. She created a narrative that was impossible to ignore, transforming their personal humiliation into a powerful indictment of the company's soul. During this time, the bond between the three of them was the strongest it had ever been. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. They ate takeout around the dining table, which was now covered in legal documents and storyboards. There were moments of levity, Yolanda mocking the sycophantic tone of a lawyer on the phone, Zara creating a hilariously complex color-coded system for levels of corporate malfeasance. David watched them, a rare, genuine smile on his face. In the midst of this ugly battle, he was getting to know his daughters on a new level, not as children to be protected, but as brilliant, capable colleagues. He had never been prouder. The healing was real. The bond felt unbreakable. And then it shattered. The breaking point didn't come from an external enemy. It came from within, from a place of love and a lifetime of protective instinct. It happened on a Tuesday night. They had just finished a grueling conference call with the legal team, finalizing their presentation for the emergency board meeting scheduled for Friday. The case they had built was ironclad. It proved a pattern of discrimination that was not just immoral, but a massive legal and financial liability. They were poised for a complete victory. David leaned back in his chair, a deep sigh of exhaustion escaping him. "We've done it," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "After Friday, this company will never be the same." Zara felt a surge of pride. "We did it, Dad." "Yeah," Yolanda added, stretching her arms over her head. "They won't know what hit them." David looked at them, his expression shifting from triumph to a deep paternal gravity. You've both been incredible, more than I ever could have asked. And now it's over for you. Zara and Yolanda exchanged a confused look. What do you mean, it's over? Zara asked. I mean, your part is done, David said, his tone gentle but firm. You've given me the evidence. You've helped build the case. I'll take it from here. You won't be at the board meeting on Friday. The statement landed in the room like a grenade. The air, which had been filled with collaborative energy, suddenly went still and cold. What? Yolanda's voice was sharp with disbelief. Of course, we'll be there. We're a part of this. We started this. And I am finishing it, David said, his voice hardening slightly. This is where I protect you. The boardroom is a shark tank. They will be looking for any way to mitigate the damage, to shift the blame. They will try to portray you as emotional, vengeful teenagers. They will dissect your lives, your social media, anything they can find. I will not put you through that. I will not let them turn you into a spectacle. He was trying to shield them, to put himself back in the role of the protector, the father who fights the monsters, so his children can sleep soundly. But he failed to see that they were no longer sleeping. They were wide awake, and they had been fighting the monsters right alongside him. So what? We're just the evidence. Yolanda's voice rose, laced with a hurt that was deeper than anger. We do all this work. We relive the worst day of our lives over and over. And now you want to bench us? Put us back in the kids' corner while the adults talk? This isn't the kids' corner, Yolanda. This is me being your father. David's voice rose to match hers. Calm, strategic CEO was gone, replaced by a dad terrified for his children. This is a brutal public fight. It's going to get into the press. Your names, your faces will be everywhere. I built this company to give you privacy and safety, not to throw you to the wolves. You think we're not strong enough to handle it? Zara asked, her voice quiet but trembling with the force of her own pain. It was a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. For 2 weeks, he had treated them as equals. Now, in the final hour, he was demoting them back to children. He was telling them, in essence, that they were a liability. This has nothing to do with your strength, David retorted, exasperated. He stood up, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. It has everything to do with my love for you. Why can't you see that? I'm trying to keep the shrapnel from hitting you. The shrapnel already hit us, Dad, Yolanda shouted, standing up to face him. It hit us in that terminal. You can't protect us from a wound we already have. All you're doing now is telling us that our voices don't matter in the end. That our pain is just a tool for you to use, and then you'll lock it away when it's not convenient anymore. The accusation struck him like a physical blow. A tool? You think that's what this is? Everything I have ever done, every single thing, has been for you. Then trust us, Zara pleaded, her heart breaking. The beautiful, powerful bond they had forged over the past 2 weeks was crumbling into dust. Trust that you raised us to be strong enough to see this through to the end. Trust us to have our own voices. Don't silence us to protect us. The word control hung in the air, ugly and accusatory. David stopped pacing. He looked at his daughters, at their flushed, angry, hurt faces. And he saw not his capable colleagues, but his vulnerable children. The trauma of that day and the deeper trauma of his own past rose up in him, a blinding, panicked fog. His protective instinct, a force of nature that had driven him his entire life, overrode everything else. It overrode logic. It overrode the trust they had built. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "My decision is made. You will not be there. This conversation is over." The finality was brutal. It was a door slammed shut in their faces. All the progress, all the healing, all the emotional bonding of the past 2 weeks shattered. Yolanda stared at him, her eyes glistening with tears of rage and betrayal. "Fine," she spat out, the word dripping with venom. "Fine. You want to fight your war alone? Go ahead, but don't you dare pretend it's for us anymore." She turned and stormed out of the room, slamming her bedroom door with a crack that echoed through the penthouse. Zara just looked at her father, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The man she had felt so close to, the man whose newly understood pain had deepened her love for him, was now a stranger. He was looking at her, but he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a ghost from his past, a child he needed to hide from the world's ugliness. He was so blinded by his own trauma that he was inflicting a new one on them. "You were right there with us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And now you're leaving us behind." "I thought we were a team." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked quietly to her own room, closing the door behind her, leaving David standing alone in the middle of the boardroom they had created, surrounded by the evidence of a battle he had just decided to fight by himself. The shatter point had been reached. The bond was broken, and everyone, in that moment, felt utterly and completely alone. The 2 days leading up to the board meeting were a frozen, agonizing silence. The Whitmore penthouse, which had so recently been a bustling hub of collaboration and familial warmth, was now a fractured landscape of closed doors and unspoken resentments. The battle plans and legal documents still littered the dining table, a mocking testament to the unity that had vanished. David found himself adrift in the quiet. He would wake up early, make coffee, and sit at the table, staring at the presentation Yolanda had so brilliantly crafted. He'd read through Zara's meticulous notes, his heart aching with a mixture of pride and a profound, gnawing guilt. He was doing what he thought was right. He was taking the bullets for them. So why did it feel so terribly wrong? His mind kept replaying the scene. Yolanda's accusation, "Don't you dare pretend it's for us anymore." Zara's quiet, devastating verdict, "I thought we were a team." He had been so certain in his decision, so driven by that primal, protective instinct. He thought back to the security guard, to the cold metal of the gun, to the feeling of absolute powerlessness. He had sworn to build a fortress of power and influence, so that his children would never feel that. But in his desperate attempt to shield them from the ugliness of the fight, had he simply locked them out of their own victory? Had he made them powerless in a different way? He, a man used to making hard decisions, to being certain. But now, for the first time in a long time, he sat alone in his downtown office, the panoramic view offering no comfort. He rehearsed the speech he would give to the board, but the words felt hollow. He was about to present Zara's research and Yolanda's video as his own findings. The idea, which had seemed like a necessary act of paternal protection 2 days ago, now felt like a theft. He would be stealing their voice, their power, their role in their own story. The choice he had made, the one born of love and fear, was beginning to feel like an act of profound pride. Meanwhile, behind their own closed doors, Zara and Yolanda were wrestling with their own choices. They were a unit, even in their separate miseries. They communicated through text messages, a stilted, pained dialogue. "Yolanda, I can't believe him. Zara, I know. Yolanda, are we just gonna let him do this? Just let him erase us from our own story. Zara, what else can we do? The door is locked. Yolanda lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The fire of her anger had cooled into a heavy, bitter residue of hurt. Her father's decision felt like a vote of no confidence. It was a declaration that, when it really mattered, he didn't trust their strength. He didn't see them as the women they were becoming, only as the little girls he needed to protect. She could choose to let that bitterness harden her. She could let him fight his lonely battle, prove him wrong by her absence. It was the proud choice, the angry choice. But it was also the one that would leave the fracture between them to fester into a permanent break. Zara sat at her desk, the screen of her laptop dark. She felt a deep, crushing sorrow. She understood her father's fear. After he had shared his story, she understood it on a visceral level. His actions weren't malicious. They were born from a deep, unhealed wound. He was a man so haunted by the ghosts of his past that he couldn't see the reality of the present. He was trying to save the 19-year-old boy he had been, and in doing so was hurting the 17-year-old women his daughters had become. She could let him. She could retreat, nurse her hurt, and allow the silence to win. It would be easier. It would mean no more conflict, no more painful conversations. But it would also mean their beautiful, powerful bond, the one that had been forged in the fire of that awful day, would be a casualty of the war. She had to make a choice, her pride or her love for her father, avoidance or a final, terrifying leap of faith. That evening, the night before the board meeting, Zara knocked softly on Yolanda's door. Yolanda opened it, her eyes red-rimmed. "He's wrong," Yolanda said, her voice thick. "I know," Zara replied. "But I think he's also just scared." She took a deep breath. "He's so scared of the world hurting us that he's doing it himself, and he can't even see it." Yolanda leaned against the doorframe, the fight draining out of her. "So what do we do, Z? Let him sideline us?" "No," Zara said, a new resolve in her voice. "We don't let him, but we don't fight him either. We show him." She looked at her sister, her plan forming as she spoke. "We show him who he raised. We show him we're not the ones who need protecting." It was a risk, a huge one. It meant choosing vulnerability over pride. It meant reaching out, even after he had pushed them away. It meant trusting that the man they had worked alongside for 2 weeks was still in there, buried under a mountain of fear. The next morning, David Whitmore stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie. It felt like a noose. He felt like a general heading into his most important battle, having deserted his best soldiers. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Zara. His heart leaped. "Zara, the car is waiting for you downstairs. We'll meet you at the office. We're not taking no for an answer." He stared at the message. It was a direct defiance of his command, but it wasn't angry. It was firm. It was resolute. It was powerful. He picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. He could call security and have them barred from the building. He could reinforce his authority, double down on his decision. He could choose his pride. He could choose his fear. Or he could choose them. He thought of their faces in the terminal, defiant and scared. He thought of them at the dining table, brilliant and tireless. He thought of Zara's quiet strength and Yolanda's fiery passion. They were not fragile. They were forces of nature. His fear wasn't protecting them, it was diminishing them. It was his wound, not theirs. His choice was made. He didn't call security. He didn't text back. He simply finished with his tie, straightened his shoulders, and walked out the door. He didn't know what they were planning. He didn't know what would happen when he got to the office. He was surrendering control. He was choosing to trust them. He was choosing vulnerability. He was choosing to believe that the team he had been a part of was stronger than the fear that had tried to tear it apart. He was choosing his daughters. David Whitmore walked into the Skyline Executive Aviation boardroom at precisely 9:00 a.m. The long mahogany table was lined with the stern, expectant faces of the board of directors, a collection of powerful, wealthy individuals who represented the old guard of the corporate world. They had been summoned to this emergency meeting with a terse, ominous memo, and the air was thick with tension and speculation. They looked at David, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, concern, and, from a few, outright hostility. David took his place at the head of the table. He placed his portfolio in front of him, but didn't open it. He simply waited. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably, unused to this silent, theatrical pause. At 9:01, the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. It wasn't an assistant with coffee. It was Zara and Yolanda Whitmore. They were dressed not in teenage clothes, but in sharp, elegant business attire that mirrored their father's. Zara wore a tailored navy blue pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a sleek, professional style. Yolanda was in a charcoal gray dress, her artist's flair subdued into a look of focused, creative intensity. They walked into the room, not with the hesitation of children, but with the unassailable confidence of people who knew they belonged there. The confidence their father had fought his entire life to give them. A murmur went through the room. One of the older board members, a man named Harrison Vance, who had known David for years, leaned forward. "David, what is this?" "This is a closed session." David didn't look at him. His eyes were on his daughters. He saw their strength, their resolve, and the flicker of nervousness they were trying so hard to hide. He felt a wave of love and pride so powerful it almost buckled him. He had made the right choice. He gave them a single, almost imperceptible nod. "It's your stage." Zara and Yolanda didn't go to the chairs beside their father. Instead, they walked to the front of the room, standing before the board as a united front. "Good morning," Zara began, her voice clear and ringing in the silent room. "My name is Zara Whitmore, and this is my sister, Yolanda. We understand that this is a closed session, but since we are the reason this session was called, we felt it was imperative that you hear from us directly." Yolanda connected her phone to the room's projector. 2 weeks and 4 days ago," she said, her voice steady and strong, "my sister and I were subjected to a humiliating and discriminatory incident at your Miami executive terminal. We were denied access to our flight, accused of being liars, and threatened with arrest. We documented the incident." She pressed play. The video filled the massive screen. The board watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Brenda's condescending smile, Robert Miller's sneering use of the word benefactor, the cold, dismissive authority of the captain. The raw, unfiltered prejudice was laid bare for them all to see. It was no longer an abstract legal problem in a memo. It was a living, breathing moment of corporate shame. When the video ended, Zara spoke again. "What happened to us was not an isolated incident. It was the symptom of a much deeper disease within this company's culture." For the next 20 minutes, Zara, with the poise of a seasoned lawyer, walked the board through her research. She presented the data, the patterns, the quiet, systemic discrimination that had been poisoning Skyline from within. She didn't just present facts. She told the story of the other clients who had been subtly and systematically mistreated. Then, Yolanda took over. She didn't just talk about the company. She talked about its soul. She spoke of her father's dream in building it to create a space of excellence, safety, and respect. And then she told his story. She told them about the 19-year-old boy held at gunpoint for the crime of having ambition. The fear that God put into my father is the same fear your employees tried to put into us, Yolanda said, her voice resonating with passion and conviction. The difference is, my father didn't let that fear break him. He used it to build this, and we will not let a culture of prejudice tear down what he built. This company is his legacy. It's our legacy, and we are here to help you save it from itself. When she finished, the room was utterly silent. The board members were not looking at David anymore. They were looking at his daughters, these two formidable young women who had just systematically and brilliantly dissected their company's greatest failing. They had taken their own pain and transformed it into an unassailable case for radical change. David Whitmore finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Question before this board is not what to do about one incident. The question is, who are we? Who do we want to be? I see who I want to be, he said, looking at his daughters with tears in his eyes. I want to be a company that is as strong, as smart, and as brave as these two young women. The resolution was swift and unanimous. David was granted full authority to implement what became known as the Whitmore Mandate, a top-to-bottom overhaul of corporate policy, including mandatory, rigorous anti-discrimination and anti-bias training for every employee from the boardroom to the baggage handlers. A new independent civilian oversight committee was established, with Zara and Yolanda invited to sit as its inaugural youth advisors. Skyline Executive Aviation, under the guidance of its founder and his daughters, began a painful but transformative journey from a source of shame to a vocal, industry-leading advocate for equality. Months later, the Miami sun once again spilled across the polished floors of the Whitmore penthouse. The suitcases were by the door again, packed for a trip to the Bahamas, a trip to celebrate not just the end of a school year, but the end of a war. David walked in, holding 3 envelopes. "These just came," he said, a smile on his face. He handed one to each of them. They were new Skyline Executive Aviation boarding passes. But they looked different. At the bottom of each pass, in elegant script, was a new company motto: excellence in flight, dignity on the ground, for everyone. Yolanda looked at the boarding pass, then at her father and sister. The 3 of them, a team forged in crisis and reunited in victory. "It's a start," she said, a grin spreading across her face. As they rode to the airport, the mood was entirely different from their last trip. It was lighter, deeper, more earned. When they walked into the Skyline terminal, a new receptionist, a young, smiling man, greeted them warmly. "Welcome, Mr. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, Miss Whitmore. We've been expecting you. Captain Rodriguez is ready for you on the tarmac." As they walked toward the glass doors leading to the jet, Zara paused. She looked at her father, her heart full. "Dad," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you." "For what?" he asked. "For trusting us," she replied. It was the most important victory of all. David's eyes welled up. He reached out and pulled both his daughters into a hug, right in the middle of the terminal he had built, now a place of true safety. A place redeemed. "You two," he whispered, his voice full of a love that was deeper and prouder than ever before, are my greatest legacy. The three of them walked out onto tarmac, toward the gleaming Gulf Stream. The promise that had been broken was now reforged, stronger than ever. They boarded the plane, not as a father and two children, but as three partners who had faced down the darkness and chosen the light. As the jet roared to life and descended into the brilliant blue sky, they left the ugly world of prejudice and fear behind on the ground, finally, truly flying free. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes our greatest pain can become the catalyst for our greatest purpose. What is a challenge you have faced that, in the end, made you or your family stronger? We can all learn from each other's resilience, so please share your experience in the comments below. Thank you for being a part of this journey today.